The first thing Sergeant Ronald Harper had to understand was that the wall had already failed. It was a little before 3 in the morning on January 31st, 1968, and the United States Embassy compound in Saigon was taking fire from inside its own grounds. That distinction mattered. Gunfire somewhere out on the street was one problem. Gunfire inside the wall meant the perimeter no longer told Harper where the danger was. He was a Marine security guard in the Chancery, the main embassy building. His job was to protect that building, the people inside it, and the sensitive spaces that could not simply be abandoned because somebody had gotten through the outer fence. The Chancery doors were still shut. The building itself had not been taken. But outside those doors, in the gardens and driveways that were supposed to belong to the American side of the perimeter, men were moving in the dark. That was the new problem. Not, is the embassy under attack? That part was already obvious. The question was much narrower. How much of the compound was still theirs? 2 Army military policemen had been working the vehicle entrance on MacDinchie Street when the attack began. Specialist Charles Daniel and Private First Class William Seabest were from the 716th Military Police Battalion security force in Saigon. They heard and saw the first attack develop at close range, called for help, and engaged men outside the compound. Then, an explosive charge opened a breach in the perimeter wall. The attackers came through. Daniel and Seabast did what fixed-post security men are trained to do before anybody has time to write a better plan. They raised the alarm, stayed at their post, and bought time for the people farther inside to understand what had happened. Both men were killed during the opening fight. I am not going to describe that in detail. The important thing for this story is what their radio call accomplished. Men inside the embassy now knew this was not fire passing the compound. The perimeter had been penetrated. Harper and the other Marine guards sealed the Chancery. Think about the geometry for a second. The embassy compound was not one building sitting alone behind a fence. There was the Chancery, the grounds around it, gates, walls, drives, smaller structures, and the nearby residence used by Embassy Coordinator Colonel George Jacobson. Once the attackers were inside the wall, every one of those spaces became a separate question. Is anybody at the gate? Is the Chancery secure? Who is in the garden? Can a reaction force get through? Can somebody inside one building reach another without crossing exposed ground? That is how the night unfolded. Not as one clean firefight, as a series of places that had to be identified again. Harper was in one of the few places that still had a clear answer. The Chancery was locked down. The attackers were outside it. For the moment, some of you who pulled embassy duty, gate duty, perimeter security, or any fixed post in Vietnam will understand why that for the moment matters. When the threat moves from outside the wire to inside it, the same wall that protected you a minute ago can start blocking your own view and your own reinforcements. If you worked a fixed post, I would be curious what changed first in your procedure when somebody got inside the perimeter. Radio traffic, fields of observation, access control, or who was allowed to move. At the Saigon Embassy, access became the immediate problem. The attackers had not captured the Chancery. They did not have to. They were inside the compound, which meant the Americans trying to respond from the street could not simply drive up and walk through the gate. The grounds had become contested space. A Marine reaction element tried to get in early and could not force the situation cleanly. Army MPs began arriving from other posts. 2 of them, Sergeant Johnny Thomas and Specialist Owen Mabust, approached the embassy in a jeep after the call for help. They were killed outside the compound. That left the men inside with a strange situation that kept getting worse, even though the attackers had not reached the building they were supposed to protect. The Chancery was secure. The compound was not. The reaction force was outside. The attackers were between them. Before that night, an embassy guard could think in layers. Street first, gate next, grounds after that, then the Chancery. Each layer was supposed to give the next one warning. The breach collapsed those layers into the same few minutes. A man at a desk or doorway inside the chancery no longer had the comfort of assuming that a sound from the garden had already been filtered by somebody at the wall. If he heard movement outside, he had to treat it as movement inside the defended area until somebody on the radio could tell him otherwise. That is a small procedural change, but it explains the whole night better than a map does. The Marines were not trying to retake Saigon from the chancery. They were trying to keep one building from becoming one more unknown space. And darkness made every doorway, planter, wall, and shadow harder to read. This is where broad summaries usually jump ahead. They tell you the embassy was attacked, the enemy got into the grounds, American forces responded, and the compound was cleared by morning. All true. It also hides the part that would have mattered most if you were Harper. Morning was several hours away. The next few minutes had to be managed without knowing exactly where every attacker was. The Marines inside the chancery had weapons available, but they could not just fire into every dark patch of their own compound. Friendly troops were approaching from outside. Embassy personnel were still in the complex. The building had to remain secure. That creates a very different kind of pressure from a patrol in open country. In the field, movement may give you choices. Inside a diplomatic compound, movement can give the other side a door. So Harper stayed where the job required him to stay. The attackers moved through the grounds. At some point during the night, fire struck the chancery area, and the situation inside became much harder to dismiss as something happening out there. Harper radioed for assistance. One later account preserves an exchange between Harper and an officer at the command post in which the officer asked, in effect, whether Harper was frightened. Harper's answer was yes. Plainly. I like that answer, because it does not need improvement. There was gunfire inside the compound. The men he was supposed to keep outside were outside his door. The reaction force had not yet gotten in. Of course he was frightened. Being frightened did not change the post. The chancery still had to stay closed. That is one of the details older military histories sometimes sand down. They turn fear into a personality test. Men who were there often remember it as information. Fear tells you the situation is no longer normal. The job is what you do after you know that. Outside, the 716th Military Police Battalion was trying to build enough strength around the embassy to get back into the grounds. The gate had become its own battlefield problem. The attackers had access to the inside. The Americans had men outside who could not simply enter without exposing themselves to fire from positions they could not fully see. So the compound had effectively been split into 3 zones. The street belonged mostly to the American reaction force. The chancery still belonged to the Marines. The space in between belonged to nobody in a reliable way. That middle space is the whole episode. The attackers used the grounds for cover. The MPs fired from outside when they could identify targets. The Marines kept the chancery from becoming another uncertain space. Every hour the building stayed locked down simplified the problem a little. The attackers were inside the perimeter, yes, but they were still outside the place that mattered most. There was another man inside the compound, dealing with that same broken geometry from a different building. Colonel George Jacobson was in his residence. At one point, he was trapped above an attacker inside the house. American personnel outside could see Jacobson at an upper window, but could not simply walk over and get him. A weapon was eventually tossed up to him, so he could defend himself until the building could be cleared. Again, the detail matters because of distance. The Americans outside were close enough to see him. They were not close enough to control the room beneath him. The entire fight was like that. Close on the map, separated by walls, gates, darkness, and uncertainty. Around dawn, the situation began to change for a simple reason. Light gave the men outside a better picture of what had been inside the compound all night. That did not make the ground safe. It made them more readable. There is a difference. The attackers had failed to get into the chancery. Their assault had stalled in the grounds, and the Americans had been building reaction forces outside the gates while the Marine Guards held the building shut from within. A helicopter tried to use the chancery roof during the fight. Enemy fire prevented one attempt from doing what the Americans wanted. Later, another helicopter was able to reach the roof. That mattered, because the compound no longer had to be solved only from the street. Now, pressure could come from above as well. Troops from the 101st Airborne Division were brought onto the roof as the effort to retake the embassy moved into its final phase. At roughly the same time, the MPs on the ground finally forced their way through the main gate. This is the moment when the shape of the fight reversed. For hours, the Americans had a secure building surrounded by uncertain ground and a reaction force trapped outside. Now men were entering from the roof and the street. The attackers had nowhere new to go, and the Marines inside the chancery could finally stop treating every sound beyond the doors as a question with no answer. The clearing operation moved through the grounds. The attackers who remained were killed or captured. The chancery itself had never been seized. That fact became important almost immediately, because early news reports made the attack sound as though the embassy building had been captured. It had not. The grounds had been penetrated. There were enemy soldiers inside the compound. That distinction may sound small now. It was not small to the Marines who had spent the night making sure the second statement never became the first. One Marine security guard, Corporal James Marshall, was killed during the embassy fight. 4 Army military policemen were also killed: Charles Daniel, William Seabest, Johnny Thomas, and Owen Mabust. Their names belong in the story because fixed-post battles can make the people who hold the first line disappear behind the name of the building. The building becomes famous. The gate guard does not. At Saigon, the first warning came from the men at the gate. The chancery stayed secure because the men inside understood that the outer perimeter was already gone and adjusted their job accordingly. The reaction force got in because other men kept trying to solve the access problem from outside. No single person controlled the whole picture. That is probably the most honest way to understand the night. Harper knew what he could hear near the chancery. The MPs knew what they could see from the street. Jacobson knew somebody was in his residence. The commanders farther away had radio reports that arrived in pieces. Nobody had the neat overhead view we have now. And the confusion produced one of the more persistent myths of Tet. For years, people repeated versions of the claim that the American embassy itself had been captured. The physical truth is narrower. The attackers breached the perimeter wall and entered the compound. They fought within the grounds. They did not take the chancery. The Marines never gave them that building. That is why I think Harper is a better center for this story than the Tet Offensive itself. Tet is enormous. Harper's problem was the size of a door. Keep it closed. Figure out what is happening outside it. Trust the radio. Do not mistake noise for information. Wait for the men outside to reach the men inside. Then, after several hours of fighting, the compound could finally be described with one word that had not been accurate since before 3 in the morning: secure. By roughly 9 that morning, the organized fight at the embassy compound was over. American personnel walked grounds that had looked completely different in darkness. There were damaged gates, the breach in the wall, abandoned positions in the garden, spent ammunition, and the physical evidence of how far the attackers had gotten, and how far they had not. The chancery doors opened onto the same compound Harper had been listening to all night. That is where I would end the story, if this were only about the Marines. But the embassy attack became famous for another reason, and it happened almost immediately. Reporters arrived. Cameras showed the breach. They showed the grounds. They showed enemy dead inside the American embassy compound. Those pictures moved faster than any careful explanation of what had actually been captured. You can understand why. A sentence saying, "The chancery remains secure," is precise. A photograph of an enemy soldier inside the walls of the United States Embassy is powerful. Both can be true at the same time. That gap between the precise military fact and the image Americans saw at breakfast became part of the larger Tet story. I do not think we need to turn this into a lecture about public opinion to understand why. Just go back to the beginning of the night. The embassy existed partly because a wall told everybody where American-controlled space began. At 2:47 in the morning, that wall stopped doing its job. For the next several hours, the Marines and MPs had to replace a failed perimeter with people. One group held the chancery from inside. Another tried to enter from the street. Later, soldiers came down from the roof. The secure area got rebuilt a few yards at a time. That is what the word secure meant by morning. Not that the attack had never reached them. It meant they had taken the compound back. Years afterward, the embassy displayed a plaque honoring the 5 Americans killed in its defense. 4 were Army military policemen. 1 was a Marine. That is a better closing than anything I could write about the symbolism of Tet. A building had walls, gates, reinforced doors, radios, guards, and procedures. When the wall failed, none of those things worked by themselves. The names on the plaque were Charles Daniel, William Seabist, Johnny Thomas, Owen Me Bust, and James Marshall. And inside the chancery that night, Ronald Harper had listened to gunfire coming from the wrong side of the wall.